The gravity of the original Betrayal to first-generation Sonic fans, classic Sonic fans, is being forgotten. Sonic the Hedgehog meant so much to so many children when the games were first released, and yet people have forgotten why. Sonic the Hedgehog was a property that was there for so many kids when nothing else was, providing the next step in opening their minds to the potential of creativity. When you look into why some classic Sonic fans seem so bitter, you start to read critiques of Sonic Adventure and sometimes even Sonic 06. You really think that is it? Really? Sega had built an empire with the Hedgehog, changed people's lives, and then kicked fans straight in the face, disappeared, and burned down the legacy, all before Sonic Adventure ever came out. Today, we are going to talk about what really happened. The story written between the lines, not spelled out in any sales data that risks being forgotten to time. Sonic the Hedgehog did not occur in a vacuum. It is a product of a fascinating development process. Sega of Japan was attempting to create a mascot-level character that would be a hit not just in Japan, but a hit for Western audiences as well. The iconic look of Green Hill Zone was inspired by a Japanese take on the state of California mixed with the Eastern influence of Japanese illustrator Eijun Suzuki. This trend isn't a first for Sega. 1986's Outrun, created by Yu Suzuki, features racing a Ferrari Testarossa Spider convertible and was inspired by the film The Cannonball Run. Yu Suzuki traveled to Europe to gain an inspiration for the game's stages. 1987's Phantasy Star, with lead graphic designer Reiko Kodama, was created in the same vein as Enix's Dragon Quest as a role-playing game, but featured a heavy Western influence from titles such as Star Wars, but with a final Japanese touch. We can see similar influences in other games from Sega at the time as well. In 1988, Sega began an in-house competition to create a rival to Nintendo's mascot Mario. Naoto Oshima eventually proposed a hedgehog-like character that was a combination of Felix the Cat's head and Mickey Mouse's body. What's interesting though is that Sega of America had a lot of input on the design as well, at least in regards to what Americans ended up seeing. The Sega of America staff, headed by Tom Kalinske at the time, hated the design and suggested changes back to Sega of Japan in hopes of making the perfect mascot character that could save the American side of Sega, which was an ever-sinking ship, especially in the console department. A compromise in design was eventually reached, and in June of 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog was released.
Sega's the best video games you can buy. Sega's excellent.
It's better than like Nintendo's.
Fantastic.
It's a rush. Ooh, Sonic. So fast.
So fun. Gotta beat the level, gotta beat the level.
Sonic the Hedgehog's first outing was big for Sega, but it did not create the cultural level event that you might think had occurred. Sonic the Hedgehog sowed the seeds of putting Sega's 16-bit console on the map. It had been out for a time, but it was not picking up in sales quite yet. At that time, the Sega Genesis was known first for being a technological novelty, not anything associated with a particular title. Prior to Sonic, the pack-in title for the Genesis was Altered Beast. Altered Beast is a game originally released in arcades that is a sacred cow to a very small number of people that love it. In the real world, I have never met a single person that didn't tire of the game after 15 seconds and then never want to play it again. When Sonic was released, it started to give Sega an identity on home consoles. After a short debate, Sega decided that Sonic was the answer, and they decided to put the pedal to the metal and begin working on 2 new titles, Sonic CD for the upcoming Sega CD, and Sonic the Hedgehog 2, produced by 2 separate development teams that would communicate back and forth. Of the 2 games, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 eventually released in November of 1992. This game is what set the world on fire, and all of a sudden, Sonic the Hedgehog became a cultural phenomenon. Every child was loving this game. Mario looked to potentially finally be unseated. It felt like it might actually happen. It was a common sentiment in these days that while Mario might have had the better game, Sonic was the cooler character. The Sega Genesis was hitting the mainstream, and when you bought the system, you got the original Sonic the Hedgehog and a coupon to mail away for a free copy of Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 allowed simultaneous 2-player cooperative play. Today, this is sometimes treated as a joke because the game centers around Sonic and Tails can easily fly off the screen, getting lost. I will say this though, it was a definite novelty at the time. When playing Super Mario Bros. Titles, we often wish that there was some form of simultaneous play to allow you and your friend, you and a sibling, or maybe even you and a parent to be able to play a game at the same time. Also, if you practiced Sonic 2 with another person, you could eventually align your play to where it doesn't matter who plays Sonic and who plays Tails, because you are working in synchronization with each other. That said, we need to look at exactly what the Sonic franchise was doing now into the second title. What gets poked fun at, labeled as 90s edge, was the result of a decade of overly puritanical, cookie-cutter media with soft, round corners that failed to elicit emotional responses. There was an underlying urge for something, anything, to be expressive and emote a dissonance with the world. Society had become increasingly bottled up and was desperate for something that felt authentic, that was good and could finally break this mold. Sonic the Hedgehog was that next step for video games. We have to step into being child-minded at this point. Today, if I was going to start talking about how I'm disappointed that Mario doesn't have a real story and isn't serious enough, I would sound ridiculous. Mario today is a breath of fresh air in that it doesn't try to challenge society. It focuses on happiness over everything else, and there isn't some deep lore that you need to study in order to be able to appreciate the series. At that time, I wouldn't say that everything was fully like Mario, but I also would not say that everything was not fully like Mario. There was not a lot that was taking the next step in suggesting a real story. With the original Super Mario Bros., our imaginations filled in the details for who these characters might be. With subsequent media, it turns out the villains weren't so scary after all. The same can be said for a lot of other Nintendo properties too. The Legend of Zelda and Metroid might suggest something a little deeper at times, but it was very rarely realized. Sonic the Hedgehog was the first mascot-style platformer where it was suggested that these characters might actually be in a living and breathing world. there might actually be a war going on with the evil Robotnik who is trying to turn all of these sentient animal creatures in the forest into robot slaves. If we keep with the story, there might actually be something more that happens. The creative level design and music aided in suggesting a world with no limits, with lost civilizations and a techno future. Sonic himself, with his speed and spin attack, led to a feeling in the gameplay where, once mastered, you felt like you were in control of the world. New players might run into enemies repeatedly every few seconds, but with practice, your skills brought about a new level of command to the environment. You were fully in charge. You were moving through the level multiple times faster than you could for any comparable video game with any comparable video game character. Typical video game power fantasies at the time had you oftentimes just punching and shooting your way to victory with straight up violence. Sonic the Hedgehog showed that you didn't even have to. It suggested that there might be a viable alternate path to victory and achieving what you want other than total brute force, as society is attempting to turn you into a robot, telling you that there is only one single path for you to go down. Sonic CD came out in September of 1993 for the Sega CD, the CD add-on system for the Sega Genesis. This was a legitimate and quality Sonic the Hedgehog game that pushed forward the world in tandem with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 that was developed during an overlapping time frame. The Sega CD as an add-on system did not sell wonderfully, so not everyone had a chance to play this game upon release. Something very controversial that spiraled out of control with this title is the US instruction manual referring to the planet that Sonic takes place on as Mobius. Suddenly, a divergence between what Americans thought Sonic was and what the Japanese thought Sonic was became a lot more pronounced beyond just some of the marketing materials. In 1992, there was a mistranslation in an issue of Sega Visions, the official American Sega magazine, as one of the main creators, Yuji Naka, was quoted as stating that for Sonic 2, the development team is doing interesting things with Mobius, where Mobius was printed with a capital M. Today, it is believed that Yuji Naka was likely referring to the terrain of Sonic 2, particularly the corkscrew paths found in Emerald Hill Zone, the first zone of the game. This misinterpretation might have stemmed from an internal document created by Sega of America for a localized backstory where they came up with the name of Planet Mobius independent from Sega of Japan. It is very possible that then Mobius became internally well known and perhaps the American staff did not ultimately remember its original origin. Back in those days as well, before mainstream internet and increasing globalization, it was considered reasonable that the Japanese might never find out what is going on with American Sonic or really any media property, as well as vice versa. This planet of Mobius, not in any of the original games, particularly with the Japanese story, was then later adopted by other media, which made the ever-looming rug pull on particularly Americans feel even worse. November of 1993 saw the release of Sonic Spinball. The Sega Genesis, not just the Sega CD, needed a killer game by Christmas to keep the Sonic spirit alive. The pinball concept for Sonic felt brilliant at the time, particularly when it was used within the main games, so why not put Sonic into an actual pinball machine? Make that the plot of one of the video games. I don't remember anyone actually liking this game, but I do remember a lot of people playing it regardless. Sonic Fever was going hardcore, and it didn't even matter. February of 1994 saw the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. We only had to put up with Spinball being the latest game for 3 months before the next big numbered title dropped. We're already on the third main game for a series that started in 1991. Wow. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 was more complex, continued the trend of having great music, and introduced a variety of new styles of levels, and you could now control Tails in flight, which led to a really fun boss fight in the third zone. Sonic and Knuckles came out in October of 1994. Not even a full year later, here we are with yet another game featuring classic style levels. It turns out that this game has lock-on technology. If you insert the Sonic and Knuckles cartridge into your Genesis and then insert Sonic 3 on top of that, you get Sonic 3 and Knuckles. The two games merge into one combined game that also lets you play as the new character Knuckles through any of the levels. Furthermore, if you insert Sonic 2 into your Sonic and Knuckles cartridge, you can play as Knuckles in Sonic 2, now with brand new areas to explore with Knuckles' climbing ability. This was conceptually nuts at the time. It is now well known that Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles were originally developed to be a single game that was released separately, sometimes considered to be a double dip by Sega to sell more units. This is moderately true. I wouldn't say that it is unheard of for a developer to call it at a certain point and decide that a game has enough material for a full title and then leave any leftovers for the sequel, or nowadays DLC. At the time, this was more of just a fun fact. I remember video game magazines referencing this, but I don't recall any of my young friends ever being bothered by this. The games felt full enough, even separately, at the time. From 1991 to 1994, depending on how you do your math and what you count, we got somewhere between 3 to 5 main titles in such a short period of time. We're skipping over the Master System and Game Gear titles as well, for the sake of simplicity, as well as because none of those games were necessarily game changers. Sonic fandom was going nuts at this time, and there was constant new material to enjoy. We have to talk about the Sonic the Hedgehog Saturday morning cartoon. The series only ran from 1993 to 1994 on American television for 26 episodes, and yet still people are talking about it today. Today, if an American cartoon like this came out for a Japanese property, I would automatically assume that nothing is canon and that nothing matters to the larger property. However, at the time, for a franchise that was already heavily American influenced, the cartoon fit in perfectly with the developing narrative of the video games and felt like a natural extension of the brand and something that would easily fit into a future title, maybe something in the next generation of systems. I felt this way at the time, knowing nothing about how these cartoons are produced, when I did not feel this way at all about the Super Mario Bros. Show. The Sonic cartoon felt 1,000 times more real to the franchise than the Mario cartoon ever did. While I didn't know the word canon at the time and hardly even understood the concept, the Mario cartoon did not feel like canon. The Sonic cartoon did. A big part of the reason why the Sonic cartoon felt so natural to what the series was doing was because it took itself seriously, at least comparatively, in a sea of cartoons that otherwise didn't. Sonic naturally fought against robots, which could be destroyed in American cartoons without freaking out the censors. There was a plot line that moved from one episode to the next in a way that you only saw in superhero cartoons. These characters were so well developed and became a natural extension of the world we were building in our minds. Princess Sally, Rotor, Bunny, Antoine, Nicole, and of course Dulcie became just as integral to Sonic as Tails was. We were setting ourselves up for so much disappointment, and we didn't even realize it at the time. Sonic and Knuckles came out in 1994. The last season of the short-lived Amazing Sonic cartoon aired in 1994. We were primed for more Amazing Sonic content, but it never came out. Sega went out for a pack of cigarettes and never returned. Sega set up this year after year expectation of quality Sonic content, and then it just stopped. The Sega Saturn, Sega's next generation console to compete with the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64, landed with a loud thud. At this time, it was inconceivable to try to release a new system without your mascot simultaneously. Logic would dictate that Sonic would be a pack-in title, and for it not to be suggested that Sega might have literally gone insane. After the horrendous 32X, the second add-on console that went back to cartridges for the Sega Genesis, it seemed like this was probably the case. What was Sega on to release Clockwork Knight as its main platformer title, which at least it felt like because it was the only platformer title, a game that no one enjoyed. You also got Panzer Dragoon. Panzer Dragoon was the game that was always on display at every Blockbuster, Toys R Us, and Best Buy when the Saturn was first released. I have much respect for Panzer Dragoon, and the graphics were amazing when I first saw it, but it's in the style of an arcade shooter where you see everything that the game has to offer within the first minute of gameplay. I realize that that is an upsetting statement, but you have to keep in mind that this is a thought that people had when determining not just whether to buy a video game, but to buy an entire console. Unless you have a culture level hit with your arcade style games, such as with Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat, or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, arcade style games do not sell consoles. People generally want a console style experience on their console. Sega at this point had lost it. There was a drip feed in magazines for a potential mythical game called Sonic Extreme, which would feature a weird fisheye lens in 3D levels while still utilizing sprites, which did suggest that maybe Sega could eventually get it together, but the game kept getting pushed out and delayed more and more year after year, and it started to feel like a cruel punchline. Okay, technically, Knuckles Chaotix did release on the 32X in 1995. When the 32X first released, no one bought it because it hardly had any games. Sega aficionados were feeling burned. The Sega CD was already getting limited support as it was, and the 32X did not make any sense when the games hardly looked any better, especially as compared to the PS1, Saturn, and Nintendo 64, which were on the horizon. It felt like a useless system, like Sega had not learned anything from the Sega CD, and in fact, they were going downhill. Knuckles Chaotix barely got any magazine coverage at all, and I hardly had any awareness of it at the time. It felt like you could probably just write it off, in addition to the honestly more mediocre Sega Game Gear games, and the title came and went without a splash. I've never seen this title in the wild owned by any of my friends. I do technically like the game, now at least, but it stung a little, and that this is what we got with no real Sonic game in sight. 1996's Sonic 3D Blast felt like a punch to the jaw. Sega couldn't even be bothered to develop their own games anymore, and at this point they decided to just offload development to what felt like a, to be nice here, B-tier developer. The Saturn was already out for a year. Super Mario 64 just came out, which changed video games forever as an unforgettable platformer that redefined what 3D video games could do. The Saturn's Sonic Extreme, the mythical title that would never be released, had screenshots that already looked dated, and the idea of it ever being released became a joke. 3D Blast was like Sega trying to feed a starving child, but instead it took a giant crap in between two slices of bread and then patted itself on the back. Seriously, this was it? The isometric view and 3D in this title felt like a joke, like Sega was telling an obvious lie but didn't think anything of it. The game sucked. It sucked then and it sucks now. Every few years I try to play it again and I remember it is not fun. It's actually even worse these days. It's not considered a mainline title today, typically when it ends up in a list of Sonic games, but it felt like at the time that maybe it was trying to be. The game then got up-ported to the Saturn, still just as terrible and still looking like a bad Genesis game, turning it into an even bigger insult. 1997 saw the release of Sonic R for the Saturn. Is this game good? Every once in a while, I'll hear somebody say how Sonic R was actually an amazing title with catchy music that you don't hear anywhere else. At the time, it felt like Sega threw in the towel, but then decided to dig up Sonic's corpse from behind the garage, stick a rocket up his ass, and send him hurling through a series of 3D courses to race. Because we wanted a racing game, apparently. I don't remember anyone being impressed by this game at the time. Sonic R took the primary spot on demo stations, so a lot more people have actually given this title at least a tiny bit of a chance than you might think. But no one was biting. It was neat as a sort of early 3D thing, but the controls were clunky. It was frustrating to play. It was limited in regards to what you could do because it was just a racing game and it wasn't a real Sonic title. It was getting sad and there was no hope for Sonic Extreme by this point. After a fantastic cartoon and yearly releases of quality core Sonic titles, we suddenly started getting nothing. Anyone who advocated for the Genesis, the underdog as compared to the Nintendo and their strict levels of censorship, felt burned with nothing good coming out. Everything they once cheered for was destroyed. The Saturn left us high and dry. The cartoon was canceled. 3D Blast sucked and tricked us all. Sonic R failed to fit the bill. Sonic Extreme was a lie. And the actual Sonic team wasn't interested in making new Sonic video games anymore. Sonic fans were feeling completely destroyed by this point. Ooh. Do we dare talk about the Sonic comic? It started in 1992 as goofy promotional material until 1993 when lead writer Ken Pender was hired. The comic slowly started to take itself more seriously and started to feel like a natural extension to the canceled cartoon series. The writing was off the wall at times, but it did provide something for the Hedgehog in carrying him forward where he was neglected by everyone else, Sega included. When Sega abandoned Sonic the Hedgehog, Ken Pender and Archie took the Blue Hedgehog under their wing and provided life support, at least giving the fans something, with potential world building that could amount to something even greater one day. It felt like there might still be some spark alive. At least it did then. Until the comic rebooted everything mid-storyline, exiling a majority of the cast and doomed the title to an inevitable cancellation. However, that is a story for another time. With the announcement of the Sega Dreamcast, it seemed like maybe Sega had learned their lesson. Their marketing for the new system almost seemed like an apology, with the Sonic team working on a brand new Sonic video game in full 3D to bring the mascot character into the current year. The game was set to launch alongside the system the way mascot character games are supposed to launch. I remember first trying Sonic Adventure in January of 1999, a full 8 months prior to the US release, when a friend of a GameStop employee brought their Japanese console into the store and hooked up the system to a small CRT so that they could try it out. What they were doing was outside of store policy, and they were really stingy and did not like the idea of letting me have a try, but I did eventually get to run through part of the first level for about 2 minutes. The high-speed gameplay, as I just scraped the surface of what this title could offer, had beautiful, amazing scenery, and it felt amazing. Maybe we could have something after all of these years of abandonment. September of 1999 hit, and the Dreamcast and Sonic Adventure released into the US. Did this save Sonic fandom? Yes and no. The game featured some cutting-edge gameplay not seen elsewhere. No 3D platformer found anywhere featured this kind of gameplay and speed, and this is still true to this day when you look at Sonic titles as compared to everything else. Sonic Adventure, though, just hit a little different. Not everyone from the classic fandom found their way back. The character designs were changed. Sega of Japan was in full control of marketing by this point, and they wanted to ensure that Sonic stayed as an edgy character by making him look even edgier. To me, the character designs started to feel like a stereotype of 90s edginess rather than something that could authentically be found during that time. Sonic the Hedgehog now felt like a separate character. Sonic Adventure did not gel well with the established storylines. Sonic and the gang were thrusted into a land of humans, which was never done before or even suggested as possible. The humans looked like generic last-gen NPCs from a bad JRPG. The world building in this game flew in the face of the cartoon and comic, the only extension of the brand up until this point that further developed the Sonic world and kept the property warm for so many years as Sega had neglected it. Within Sonic Adventure, it did not seem like Sega was putting any effort into making it fit at all with these previously established properties, causing the dissonance to hit even harder, which was a disservice to the old fans who had been enjoying the old titles and old media so much. They really could have done something better to build that bridge, even if this was the direction that they wanted to go in. Sonic Adventure also has a lot of dull and boring parts with non-Sonic-like gameplay that just gets in the way. I remember lying to myself, trying to convince myself that certain parts of the game were good, even though I really wasn't enjoying it, just so that I could get to the Sonic levels, essentially. You have to deal with a lot of mediocre content to get to the good stuff. So many classic Sonic fans have fallen off over the years, although many still look back fondly on the original titles, even the fans who have never even played a 3D Sonic the Hedgehog game. Something I wrestle with in doing this video presentation is the idea that perhaps Sega was on the verge of a Sonic burnout in the fandom at the time. After all, Sonic 3, while it sold well, sold a lot less than Sonic 2. Does this mean that the franchise would have hit a wall even if Sega did continue to release new titles? I can see the argument for them to chill out at least a little on the release schedule at that time. That, or start to experiment with new styles of gameplay. I think that they could have made it work. Between the handhelds and consoles with quite a few spin-off games, Sega went right back to the non-stop releases after Sonic Adventure did come out. Some fans, though, had already been lost forever. So, if you made it this far into the video, I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on where Sonic has come and gone over the years. Do you feel like Sega has ever mistreated or abandoned Sonic the Hedgehog? This story, this Sonic cycle, has repeated many times throughout the years, but in varying fashions. I'll be honest, after Sonic Adventure, I stalled out on caring for the series for a few good years. I played Shadow the Hedgehog through a rental, which was terrible, and then I bought Sonic 06 when it came out. There are specks of promise in that game, but the load times are just atrocious. The physics were really not good. Since then, though, I have played every major release with the exception of Sonic Boom because, yeah, that title. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love reading them and I love responding to them as well. I love it when the comments feel like a community is starting to grow. Be sure to hit that like button as well. It does help with the algorithm. And subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching.